my colleagues from psychology, Associate Professor Michelle Hood, who's our acting head at school. We were just talking about juggling roles, so it's always very interesting. And Michelle's done a lot of work on youth development, and yeah, and is a joy to work. We're working together on an ARC and trying to keep up with that. But Michelle's talking to us today about precarious employment and youth development. So over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks for the invite. So, this work that I'm talking about today is a sort of an overview, I suppose, of some work that I've been doing with colleagues over the last few years, predominantly with Peter Creed, who's also at Griffith and a member of WOW, but also Eva Solenko from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. Eva, I believe, at least was, but I think still is an adjunct member of WOW. Hu Shi from Nanjing Normal University in China, and some students that have contributed along the way as research assistants all through honours or undergraduate projects, Luella, Alana, Lachlan and Claire. So Peter and I have spent probably the better part of the last decade looking at how students juggle work and study, and our particular focus has been on those sort of developmental aspects that are important in young adulthood, like career development, obviously academic success, given that they're students, but also aspects of psychological well-being as well. For the last 3 years, we've really switched our focus more narrowly to looking at the impacts of precarious employment on working students, and again looking at those same sorts of outcome measures. So I just wanted to, I guess, give you a timeline of this research that we've been doing, and I guess the subtitle to this is sort of how to do research on the smell of an oily rag, and how to sort of build in the hopes that you'll actually get some money to actually do what you really want to do in this area. So the impetus to us looking at precarious employment actually came from attending a presentation at WOW in mid-2018 that Eva had done. Her focus is very much on in-work poverty and precarious employment and unemployment in relation to that. And we got really excited by that, and we could see how that would relate to the work that we were doing with working students. Peter achieved some small seed funds from WOW in the latter part of 2018 to do a systematic literature review, because we weren't sure how much of the work had actually been done around precarious employment in young adults who were still completing their education prior to entering the adult workforce. And our particular focus in that systematic literature review was around the career and work correlates of precarious employment for those young people. We then I received some funding from the School of Applied Psychology, again some small seed funding to develop a scale to measure precarious employment in these young working students, and that need was highlighted by the work we've done on that systematic literature review, and I'll talk about that in detail. We then used that scale that we developed and have subsequently published in a series of studies, pretty much unfunded, done through honours projects and our own hard work. And so Alana did an honours project using that scale, and I'll present the results of that in what I talk about today. We collected some more data, another sample looking at different variables to test a different model in the end part of 2019. And we used that work to date to develop an ARC discovery project submission for the 2021 round, and received a small amount of funding from the School of Applied Psychology to support that grant writing. That was also supported by some work from a Health Dean Research Summer Scholarship recipient, Lachlan, who I supervised, and he did some literature review and data analysis around the data we'd collected that was contributing to that ARC submission. Sadly, that was not successful, and that didn't deter us. We put it in again with updates based on our ongoing development as researchers in this area, and based on feedback we'd received from the 21 submission. We were a near miss for that 21 submission, so we had hope. And so that one's still under review, and we'll find the results of that in the next few weeks to months. This year, I've had another honours student collecting another sample of data, looking at another aspect, a different model again, but with that precarious employment at the heart of it. So what I'll do is talk about some of the outcomes of that research, some of the studies that we've completed to date. First of all, just to clarify what we mean when we talk about precarious employment, and why bother initially before I talk about what we've actually found. The why bother is because this has really become the new normal. Currently, almost 50%, I think it's about 49.5% of adult Australians are working in jobs that could be considered to be precarious. They're no longer working in our traditional standard permanent type employment positions. So precarious employment is work that's characterised by uncertainty, by low income, limited social benefits and statutory entitlements. So there's a lot of instability. The bargaining over employment conditions is at the individual level rather than the enterprise level like we experience at the university. Low wages and therefore strong associations with economic deprivation, in-work poverty, the idea of working but still being actually below the poverty line. Limited rights in the workplace and social protections, and therefore a lot of vulnerability. So, you know, we've seen a lot of high profile cases in the media over the last few years around students, particularly in precarious employment, where they've been working for well below the award wages, you know, at great risk of being sacked with no reasons or very flimsy reasons, really being exploited. So it is an important thing to understand. It can often be termed in different ways. It can be zero hour contracts where there's no guaranteed hours in any week and the number of hours changes. The employer has little control over that. Casual, temporary, short-term contracts, agency work. Also, gig economy work and self-employment is thought by many to fall into this category because it fulfills a lot of those characteristics. Oh no, I'm not moving on. Hang on, what's gone wrong there? Oh. Okay. Precarious employment and students is what we're particularly interested in. And so one of the reasons that we're interested in looking at students is pretty much that's what we're interested in. But more broadly, young people are more at risk of precarious employment than what I'm going to call adults. So people who are sort of over about the age of 25 or so are less at risk for precarious employment than the youth population. And within that, students are particularly vulnerable. They tend to work in service industry jobs, things like retail and hospitality, that are by their nature precarious. They meet a lot of those characteristics of precarious employment. Pocock described these industries as ones in which the employer wanted cheap, pliable and dispensable employees. What we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic has been that these sorts of precarious sectors have been the ones that have been hardest hit. We know, our students have, been very vulnerable to losing their jobs or having their hours really drastically reduced during COVID. And they've been the sort of jobs that have been that have shown less recovery as other sectors have started to recover from the pandemic economic issues. So what we know is that about 84% of students today work while they're studying, and a lot of them work because they need to support their study and to support themselves really as they study. It's not generally for, lifestyle reasons, it's generally because they have to. So they are an important population and they are particularly vulnerable. So the first thing we did in this regard was to do the literature review to see what was actually known about precarious employment in these young people. And what we found was pretty much not a lot. What we particularly focused on was career-related correlates, things that may be antecedents to precarious employment or consequences of that employment, with a particular view to looking at adolescent and young adult populations who were still studying, so high school students, uni students, and near graduates, people who just graduated in the last couple of years. There was little research in general about that young population, very little about students, and even less about the career-related outcomes. So that led us to really think that this was a worthwhile area of research to pursue. What we did find was that the picture with education level and education type was not as straightforward as you might think when it comes to precarious employment. One of the things that we know about with tertiary students is that they often choose or prefer precarious employment because it suits their particular context at the time. So they're not necessarily looking for the sort of standard permanent full-time types of work. The casual, short-term, 0-hour types of contracts will often suit them. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't make them vulnerable. In terms of how education level relates to precarious employment risk, vocational education, particularly at the intermediate to high levels of vocational education, so not the really low levels, Cert 3s and things like that, but more substantive vocational education seems to be the one that's associated with less likelihood of young people ending up in precarious employment, both currently as well as over the longer term. So Chesters and Quavo found that at 28 years of age, the risk of being in, or the percentage of people who were in precarious employment was 28% for people who had postgraduate qualifications, around 20% for high school or undergraduate qualifications, and 14% for people with vocational education qualifications. So, you know, you might think more education actually protects against it, but it doesn't necessarily. And so again, that sort of fueled our belief that looking at tertiary students doing this sort of work was probably important, because tertiary education is no protection against ongoing precarious employment. The other aspect that Chesters and Quavo found was that transition from precarious employment, for example, perhaps when they're studying, into standard employment, was actually also less likely for people who had tertiary education than those with lower levels of education. So again, this is an important population to understand. Employment history plays a role, and so not surprisingly, the longer periods of time, or the more numbers of distinct periods of unemployment or precarious employment that an individual has had, the more likely that they will have ongoing precarious employment. Parental work history also plays a role, suggesting some developmental influences, but probably also socioeconomic influences on the likelihood of precarious employment. And again, importantly for us, high school work experiences that were precarious, in precarious jobs, which again is pretty much typical for high school students in those service industry roles, that influenced the beliefs that young people had about work and the value of work in adverse ways, and also their beliefs that this was going to be their future, that they weren't looking forward to standard, permanent, stable employment, but that they saw the future in very precarious terms. And we know that the attitudes that people have at that sort of mid-teenage age is predictive of the extent to which they're likely to be in precarious work in that sort of young adulthood period, beginning of middle adulthood around the 30s. So these attitudes and beliefs that are being formed early by these experiences do seem to have long-term influences. Again, meaning that looking at this population and their experiences from a developmental point of view is really important. Surprisingly, I think people who were in precarious employment actually had more positive attitudes about the value of work than those who were unemployed, but they were more dissatisfied, except when the precarious work they were doing related to their qualifications or their professional identity, in which case then they felt quite satisfied despite the precariousness of the work or the employment situation. So again, it's more, we think about the sort of perceptions and individual experiences than looking just at objective measures of the types of contracts they have or the types of work that they're doing that's important. One of the things that we found out of our literature review and has been criticised by a number of people is that a lot of the existing work looking at precarious employment has been actuarial or descriptive in nature, where simple binary categorical measures of precarious employment are used. So really focusing on the type of employment contract or the number of hours of work that people have. So is it part-time, full-time, permanent, temporary, that sort of thing. And what we know about the construct of precarious employment or perceived precariousness is that it's multifactorial and that the individual's perceptions are probably more important than that objective contract type. So as a result, we saw a need to develop a scale to measure that perceptions of precariousness in employment at the individual level, particularly for these young working students. There is one existing scale to measure employment precariousness, the employment precariousness scale developed by Vivas and colleagues from South Australia. Problem with that is it's got poor psychometric properties. It's very complicated to score it, so it's quite cumbersome to use. And the focus is very much designed for adults who are in the full-time adult, well, not the full-time, but in the adult workforce, not for these young students who are still making that transition to the adult labour market. So we used those existing scales as well as related scales like scales of job insecurity and the conceptual literature around precarious employment, including the results of our own literature review to develop items for a new scale, particularly focused on young working students in this sort of employment. We pitched the reading level at 5th grade, which is the recommendation for scale development for adults. Sadly, even with university students, the reading level of 5th grade is usually the best one to ensure that they can understand. We used a frequency response format and we collected data from working students, conducted an exploratory factor analysis and some initial validation. The EFA yielded 4 factors with 3 items per factor, so a 12-item scale, which was ideal from our purposes. We were looking to develop a brief scale that would therefore be quite user-friendly for use in research. Those 12 items extracted 76% of the variance, so good in terms of the recommendations for scale development. And we had good factor loadings of the items between 0.59 and 0.94. The 4 factors that we extracted all had good reliability, good internal consistency, and we labelled these precarious conditions, so things like how much say the individual had in the hours of work or the timing of shifts. The second one was around security or insecurity of the job, the extent to which they were concerned about losing their job in the future. The third one was about remuneration precariousness, so the extent to which they had that low income not sufficient to live on and do the things they needed to do. And the fourth one, flexibility or inflexibility, was really around the threat that if they needed time off, needed flexible arrangements because of their study roles, that they would be in danger of losing their job or having the hours substantially reduced. We found evidence for construct validity by expected correlations with job insecurity and with life satisfaction. Because of the potential criticism that really is precarious employment anything other than job insecurity, we demonstrated that our scale had incremental validity over and above a well-established measure of job insecurity and some known demographic correlates of life satisfaction. So we're quite confident that this is measuring something above and beyond just simple job insecurity. We then collected another sample and did a confirmatory factor analysis and some further validation. We tested 4 models in that using the confirmatory factor approach. The first model A was a simple unidimensional model in which all of the items, the variance in the items was accounted for by that single common source of variance. Model B was a 4-factor solution. This diagram here is just the theoretical one from Rees and colleagues. So ours, we had 4 factors and 12 items. So that was the items loading on individual but correlated factors. Model C imposed a second order factor on that with a measurement model over the top of the correlations between those factors. And then finally, model D, we tested a bifactor model, which is a latent structure in which the items load on a general factor that reflects the individual differences in that target dimension of interest, so the precarious employment. And then there are orthogonal group factors that are the item response variation that's not accounted for by that general factor. We used, as usual, a Keki's information criterion to determine the best fit among those 4 models. And we found that that unidimensional model just didn't fit at all. The other 3 did, but the best fit was the 4-factor model that we had found in the EFA as well. We found evidence for validity of use at both the total score level as well as for subscale levels as well. And we showed construct validity by expected correlations with both the total score and the subscale scores, and workplace support, negative correlations as we'd expect, and financial strain positive as we would expect. So armed with this psychometrically sound measure of perceived precariousness in their employment, we then set about doing a number of studies to test models derived from theory and existing empirical evidence, largely from adults in the adult workforce, but in precarious work. So our own literature review, as well as recent meta-analyses and literature reviews by others looking at working adults, showed that precarious employment was related to negative health and wellbeing outcomes. That's mostly what the literature is focused on, health outcomes and how precarious employment adversely affects health, but also well-being and quality of life. So that most of that work was done with working adults. What Utset and we found is that basically those same outcomes occurred for young people in precarious employment. And importantly, from our point of view, those effects last for 5 to 10 years. So that developmental focus is important to take. The theoretical explanations that we looked at initially and that others had looked were really those based on theories that many of you might be familiar with around stress and strain, like Robert Karasek's job strain model. We used this model that Bennett and colleagues derived out of their systematic literature review to guide the first couple of studies we did. And so what we were interested in that regard was, let me see if I can get my pen to work here. Yep, we're interested in this right-hand end. It doesn't mean that the left-hand end here is not important. You know, obviously politics, labour market forces, policies, welfare provision, all of those sorts of things clearly drive precarious employment, underemployment, unemployment. But that's the realm of economists, political analysts and theorists, sociologists, not psychologists or psychological researchers. we're interested in this end in terms of what the outcomes of precarious employment are for the experience of the individual. So the first study we did using the scale that we had developed, we looked at precarious employment and burnout in working students, and we examined underlying mechanisms derived from the existing literature. So we looked at precariousness leading to greater strain, and through that to sleep disturbance and then to burnout. And what we have found was essentially what we had predicted, that first of all, the overall model from precarious employment through both financial and job strain to that sleep disturbance, poor sleep quality, to burnout was supported. The model had good fit. We followed the recommendations of Shrout and Bolger about testing these direct and indirect effect models. And we then tested a direct effects model only, and then the direct effects plus the indirect effects model, and found good fit for the models all along. The indirect effects model clearly was the ultimate one that we were actually interested in. And what I should say is that all of this work that we've been doing is been with cross-sectional samples to date. If we get any large funding, then the plan is to do this longitudinally and then be able to better test really, in fact, what we would call mediation models rather than really just looking at these indirect and direct paths at a cross-sectional level. So what we found is that I think importantly, we had in these models, there's my little pen, we control for hours worked because one of the things with students in particular is that there's a lot of literature around sort of cut-off points after which work hours really start to impact on study and well-being. Often around 8 to 10 hours a week is the sweet spot after which you start seeing impairments. But what we were able to demonstrate is that after controlling for the amount of hours they were working, there were still effects of the precariousness of work. So the quality of the work matters over and above the actual amount of work that they're doing. And we controlled for gender, which females were more likely to report higher burnout than males were. So what we found is that the conditions aspect of precariousness was not independently related to anything in the model. So this was around the extent to which they had control over their shifts, the number of hours they got, those sorts of things. It was the other aspects, the job insecurity, the remuneration and the flexibility or inflexibility that were actually important predictors. Not surprisingly, the job insecurity and the remuneration were both predictive of financial strain, and insecurity as well as the flexibility aspect predicted the job strain. These two forms of strain, particularly job strain, was the stronger one, predicted sleep quality and through that burnout. In terms of the indirect effects, we found that the direct effect from the insecurity aspect of precariousness to sleep quality and also to burnout was fully explained by these indirect serial paths. And we found that the direct path from financial strain through to burnout was also explained by the disturbance of sleep quality, but there was still some direct effect of job strain on student burnout, although it was substantially explained by sleep quality, but not completely. Overall, we explained 27% of the variance in financial strain, 39% in job strain, and 34% in sleep quality. Overall, 72% in burnout, which is, quite substantial. The important outcomes were that these impacts on students are not just from the number of hours that they work, that it's the quality of the work that they're doing, which is also important, and that it's job security or insecurity and the flexibility aspects that are important, not the actual conditions around the number of hours, the sense of control they have over the number of hours or the shifts, the timing, you know, do they get them on weekends or after hours or on days that they need to go to uni? That didn't seem to be independently relevant. One of the explanations there is that university students might strategically choose jobs in which the conditions actually suit their study needs. And that might be why we're finding that that one's not independently predicting once everything else is put into the model. Important things from a student point of view is that we know that a couple of these variables that precariousness seems to be operating through in terms of affecting burnout are also related to adverse academic outcomes. So job strain is known to be related to greater dropout in students, more likelihood to drop back to part-time loads, therefore longer time to graduate, lost wages because of that, not graduating on time, and lower academic engagement, therefore adverse outcomes for academic performance. And we know that sleep quality also is related to both cognitive performance in general and through that, obviously, to academic performance. So one of the expectations we have is that precarious employment affects academic outcomes as a result of these sorts of strains that it puts on the study role, on managing that study role at the same time. And so that's what my honours student at the moment is looking at. But that's still a work in progress, due to be submitted in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. We also looked at the more positive side of wellbeing and extended this work looking at the underlying mechanisms that explain the relationship between precariousness and wellbeing, but also then included some moderating factors, looking at what might protect these working students against adverse effects on their well-being. In this case, we examined, therefore, a moderated mediation model using the process macro that you might be familiar with, model 15, if you're really familiar. And we looked at positive well-being. We looked at eudaimonic well-being, which is, well, the measure we used was one that the OECD had recommended in their guidelines for measuring subjective well-being. Was based on the, or used by, I'm not sure which one came first, but the European Social Survey, which is a big survey administered every couple of years across Europe. It was based on that measure and also very closely aligned to Ed Diener's flourishing scale. So that was what we had as the outcome measure in this particular model. Again, we sort of basing the overall conceptual framework on this model of Banach et al. That have been derived from their literature review. And we were looking at precarious employment predicting, in this case, well-being rather than the health and quality measures that they'd been focused on. And we looked at it, we looked at the underlying mechanisms through just one of these hazardous working conditions, the psychosocial aspects, which is generally operationalised as the sort of social and supportive relationships in the workplace. We operationalise that as work colleague support and work supervisor support. The other form of precarious employment is the one that relates to actually hazardous conditions like being exposed to radiation and chemicals and those sorts of things. We have no interest in that aspect of precarious employment at all. So we were just looking at the psychosocial aspect. And we also looked at the other underlying mechanisms through the material deprivation, through the aspects of low income. And we then looked at this potential moderator in terms of social and family networks and support moderating those relationships in that model, so that non-workplace based support. And what we found was more or less what we had predicted. Again, like the other study that Creed had led, we didn't find conditions having any independent contributions in the model once everything else was in there. We found that the two aspects around security and remuneration were those that were driving the material deprivation. not surprisingly. And all of the aspects of precariousness, except for the conditions, predicted that perception of workplace support from the supervisor and the colleagues, with that sense of flexibility about the work being the strongest predictor. So the more they felt that if they needed time off or they asked to be flexible, the likelihood would be that they would lose hours or get sacked, the more they perceived the workplace as not being supportive. And it was that workplace support that was the independent driver of this eudaimonic well-being. Material deprivation didn't have an independent effect on that well-being, and we control for subjective SES in this model. We found, however, that some of these relationships were conditional on the level of non-workplace support that they had, defined as their friend support, their outside social support. And we found that when the security aspect of precariousness was high, or as it was increased, then well-being plummeted. But that was only for these people who didn't have external social support. When they had external social support, then that higher level of perceived insecurity didn't actually influence their well-being. So external social support was protective. And we found a similar pattern with the flexibility aspect. When it was high, well-being plummeted, but that was only the case for people who didn't have that external social support. When they did, well-being was protected. And I think, that sort of speaks a lot to how we might look at working with these young people to protect them, despite the fact that we know they're going to end up working in these precarious jobs. We didn't explain as much variance in this positive aspect of well-being as we did in the negative aspect of burnout. So overall, 37% of the variance, 30% we explained in well-being, 37% in that workplace support was explained by precariousness, and 22% in that material deprivation. Again, the influence of that perceptions of precariousness on what we might typically think about, like the low income and the conditions, we just aren't finding that. It seems to be more around what we would call more of the psychological sort of elements seem to be more important. So in terms of practical implications, it seems that organisations that employ these students in precarious conditions would do well to, in fact, ensure that there was good workplace support and to allow flexibility around their study needs. That would go a long way to protecting their well-being, and when there's good well-being, then usually you see better job performance and productivity. So it's in the organisation's interests. Similarly, universities, ensuring that, knowing that most of our students work, knowing that most of them work in precarious jobs, supporting that flexibility to work and study, I think is really important. And, I think COVID has probably pushed us a lot further down that direction of flexible delivery of our content than might have occurred without COVID as a stimulus. The psychosocial risks that workplace support seem to be more important to well-being than the economic risks from precarious employment, at least in this student sample. And the external social support is really important to protecting against that precarious workplace effects on well-being. So from there, we then moved on from, a lot of the research has looked at those aspects of well-being. Our real interest was in the career development aspects as well as the academic aspects. And so that's what we're currently working on at the moment. So this study, what we were interested in is the way in which precariousness in the workplace, what the individuals might be able to do to actually improve their perceptions or their experiences of that situation. And we'd done some work previously looking at job crafting and looking at that again with working students and how that might positively influence some of the outcomes that we were interested in. So Job crafting theory argues that basically the conditions, meaning and identity that are ascribed to jobs by employers are not fully determined by the actual objective conditions or characteristics of the jobs, that they can be crafted by the individual to suit the way they want to experience or perceive the job and to experience themselves as the person in that job, so their identity. And so in this study, what we've looked at is the way in which precariousness is related to the capacity to accumulate career capital, which is one of the positive aspects of working while studying, that you develop those skills that will actually give you capital going forward into the adult workforce. But looking at how it is that precariousness might erode the opportunities to accumulate that career capital, and where the opportunities to craft the job is the underlying mechanism there. Ultimately, what we're interested in is looking at whether or not crafting can be used as a form of intervention to support these young people to, in fact, protect their career development. There's three ways in which people can craft their jobs. They can physically craft, so they can change the tasks to change the demands. They can craft the meaning that they ascribe, so cognitively craft and change the way they think about the job, and they can craft the relationships or the social resources in the job. So we found that job characteristics does predict the extent to which working students use crafting strategies, and particularly characteristics of jobs like the extent of the demands and the sense of autonomy, which really relate to precarious characteristics. That did predict crafting, and crafting in turn predicted, in that case, what we looked at was the ability of the work role to facilitate the study role. So for the young people to use capital accumulated in the work role to facilitate their study role. So we then extended this to look at it specifically with precarious employment. Again, we found largely what we predicted, that precarious employment erodes the climate in the organisation for crafting. So the climate needs to really be there to enable the individual to craft optimally. When the climate is positive and conducive to crafting, then we get more crafting in each of those forms of crafting. When people craft, particularly the cognitive crafting and the relational crafting, then we do see the capacity to accumulate capital. Crafting the task, changing the sort of demands and requirements of the job that they're doing, looking at other ways to do the job, that didn't relate to career capital. The cognitive, the meaning ascribed, and the relational, the building up of relational resources was what was important to career capital. And again, what we found is that largely these elements of crafting, both the climate which the organisation provided to enable that, as well as the individual proactively crafting, did affect the accumulation of the accumulation of career capital. So again, we explained reasonable amounts of variance in career capital. Almost half of the variance in career capital was explained by this model from precariousness through crafting. And crafting meaning was important to both career social capital and professional capital. The crafting of relationships was only independently related to that social capital. We know social capital in the workplace is important. We found that with our other study, looking at promoting well-being. Crafting work tasks, a little bit like the idea of conditions, didn't seem to be really important for these young people. What we know is that role crafting can be trained, and that when people are trained to use crafting strategies, there are a number of important outcomes around employability, well-being, productivity, those sorts of things. So that's what we're looking at doing and seeking funding for, is really looking at working with young people to develop strategies, despite being in precarious employment, to actually really craft the way they experience it, what they can get out of it, to build capital for their future careers. So finally, I think what it seems is that precarious employment is the way of the future. It's probably not going away. Yes, we should fight it from those things on the left side of that model, the political and policy and economic labour market things. But from an individual perspective, we need to look at how we can actually promote healthy development despite this precarious employment, and how we can actually use intervention strategies. And we're focused on this idea of crafting strategies to, in fact, facilitate that future career, as well as academic development and well-being in these young people. So thank you. And I've gone only 1 minute over the time, so I